As part of the world's most lethal and diverse air and space forces, you have a key role in creating an inclusive culture that values all total force professionals, military and civilian. It is the Department of the Air Force's goal to enable this responsibility by providing insight and perspective around the topic of unconscious bias. With that, I invite you to join me in a visualization activity. Please close your eyes, clear your minds, and imagine. You're rushing to make your way to the dental clinic for an appointment. You're running late. As you hurry to enter the building, you're greeted by a pilot who's standing inside the lobby area. You now find yourself at the food court, having lunch, where you overhear two master sergeants making anniversary plans. Later that day, you're seated in an auditorium where one of the most dynamic motivational speakers is about to speak to your organization. By now, you should have a solid picture firmly planted in your mind. Now open your eyes, because I have a few questions for each of you. First, did you visualize the pilot as a Black African-American woman? Did you identify the military couple at the food court to be men? And finally, was the motivational speaker an individual with a physical disability? If you answered no to any of these questions, then welcome to the human race. This activity was modeled after a TED Talk presentation given by unconscious bias expert Valerie Alexander, and it powerfully highlights how our brains associate with patterns that we recognize as familiar and normal. Now keep in mind, all of this happens instantaneously. The brain struggles with what's not familiar, and the swift, occasionally erroneous associations that result from this process point to the human condition of bias. The foundation of any successful organization is centered on the strength of interpersonal relationships across all dimensions of diversity. Your commitment to ensuring every member of your team feels a sense of belonging cannot be overstated. Understanding unconscious bias is vital to this end. Unconscious bias, also known as implicit bias, refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Bias operates from the mental models and book of rules that are shaped and hardwired from our socialization, the process by which individuals acquire the values, habits, and attitudes of society. These paradigms are introduced, enforced, and reinforced by our parents, friends, education, and life experiences, to name a few. These experiences frame our viewpoints and approaches to resolving complex problem sets. Consider how two or more individuals can look at the exact same issue, yet have vastly different interpretations and positions. We also use these experiences to fill in the blanks about others who may be different than ourselves. For example, consider how we may view others from a generational perspective. Our experiences and knowledge about people that we label like that may influence our approach on how we'll engage with that individual. Stereotyping is often a powerful and dangerous consequence if our biases are left unchecked. Let's consider some other aspects around this topic. For example, intelligence, confidence, and success have little bearing on one's susceptibility to bias. In fact, research reports that those of high cognitive ability are likely more vulnerable in this space. Implicit and explicit biases are related but distinct mental constructs. They're not mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other. Finally, the implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. As one can see, bias is complex and has broad implications in the human experience. This complexity is represented in many forms and configurations, and the origins of its research can be traced back to the early 70s. That's why a graphic like the Cognitive Bias Codex is so revealing, as it identifies over 180 specific types of cognitive biases and visually depicts their relationships. These biases are interconnected as well. Take, for instance, a tendency where I seek out those who are like me and succumb to affinity bias. This may drive who I deem important in my inner circle, and as we start to deliberate on potential ideas or solutions, it's likely the bandwagon effect, or groupthink bias, will permeate our outcomes. Unconscious bias may also drive behaviors that can be seen at the systemic level. Let's take a look at one particular type. Value attribution bias represents our tendency to bestow certain qualities upon a person or object based on our perceived value. One particular study shows that approximately 60% of male CEOs are 6 feet or taller, whereas only 15% of males in the US population fit in the same category. This attribution can also be applied to how we judge spoken accents. Researchers at the University of Chicago and Tel Aviv University discovered that we tend to believe people more when they have accents that are more similar to ours, and less when they are more different. Up to this point, we've discussed what unconscious bias is, but why is this important to the Department of the Air Force as a warfighting organization? In March 2019, Air Force Chief of Staff General David Goldfein made a bold proclamation at the Air Force Association Symposium. The chief noted that embracing diversity has never been more important in today's Air Force. In essence, it's a warfighting imperative. The complex challenges we face demand creativity and innovation. Leaders at all levels must embrace different perspectives to provide the solutions required to fight and win. In order to unleash the full potential of our greatest weapon system, our diverse people, all professionals must be able to address the impacts of bias and mitigate its effects. One key example where this necessity is unveiled is the process of how teams generate decisions and solve complex problems through creative solutions. The body of research supports the case for teams that intentionally gather broad input and actively include diverse perspectives to create a decisive advantage in today's complex and rapid environment. This inclusive approach helps reduce cognitive biases and improves accountability. One particular study by Professor Nancy J. Adler highlighted the behaviors of high-performing multicultural teams. Her research noted that high-performing teams acknowledge and value differences. They focus on relationships and healthy disagreement. There are few or no unwritten rules, and honesty is rewarded. Studies also show that teams with visible diversity communicate more fully when engaged in team problem-solving tasks, and this improves outcomes. The key takeaway I'd like to emphasize here is that inclusive leadership is absolutely paramount in effectively navigating conflict, leveraging perspectives, and capitalizing on the power of diverse talent. It's not enough just to be aware of unconscious bias and understand its impact on the mission and our relationships. We have to act. Your ability to acknowledge, calibrate, and transform will positively influence your path to becoming more inclusive wingmen and space professionals. Now acknowledging your biases is the most important and often the most difficult step. Again, to have bias is to be human. First, we have to overcome the good-bad fallacy, where good people are unbiased and bad people are biased. This perspective serves as a major deterrent toward honest self-examination. In his book, Everyday Bias, author Howard Ross notes how awareness of our biases is important in order to anticipate their impact on ourselves and others. He states that when we pinpoint where our biases come from, we often discover they're not based in a rational reality, but rather a social or emotional construction generated somewhere in our past. When you start to acknowledge, accept, and own your stuff, you take accountability, and in turn, will elicit more positive behaviors. To acknowledge bias, one must also continue to learn and understand how it shows up in our world. Let's explore a couple of examples. As you view the photo, I want you to consider your own thinking and immediate assumptions about the individual pictured. Think about your feelings, reactions based on what you notice. Consider the individual's approachability. Some would categorize this as warmth. Also, assess his level of competence, which is often aligned with respectability. Research from Amy Cuddy and colleagues at Harvard University discovered we tend to use those two traits to evaluate people. Finally, consider a likely position or career that the individual may reside in. As you reviewed the details of the image, your brain digested specific patterns and associated that data with meaning. Again, all of this happens in milliseconds. So let's move on to the big reveal. As you can see, John Fetterman has an impressive resume. He was the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania. That tattoo on his arm represents the zip code he identifies with. He has a master's degree from Harvard. And a bonus tidbit for you, John Fetterman is currently serving as Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania. This activity highlights a form of bias referred to as diagnosis bias. Whether it's analyzing and judging one based on their physical stature or giving the angry eye to someone wearing the jersey of a hated college football rival, we make judgments in spontaneous situations. Let's explore one more type of bias. According to Psychology Today, confirmation bias occurs from the direct influence of desire on beliefs. When people would like a certain idea or concept to be true, they end up believing it to be true. Once we have formed a view, we embrace information that confirms that view while ignoring or rejecting information that casts doubt on it. We Pick out those pieces of data that make us feel good because they confirm our assumptions. Consider how this plays out in your choice of media outlets and sources of news. Confirmation bias may push us toward websites with information that confirms our beliefs and away from websites that conflict with our views. Finally, one has to look no further than the smartphone, where information is often filtered based on one's search preferences. We also have to acknowledge that unconscious bias, if left unchecked, can lead to behaviors that have devastating impacts on our professional relationships and workplace environment. The manifestation of unconscious bias is exhibited in acts of exclusion and may ultimately lead to discrimination. Another form of biased behavior are microaggressions. According to noted expert Dr. Daryl Wing Su, microaggressions are indirect, subtle, or unintentional insults or slights directed against members of a marginalized group. Presented are a few common examples and the impacts they cause. The second strategy of the ACT model is to calibrate. In this, step 1 is looking to adjust perceptions so they can be used in an accurate way. Up to this point, we've acknowledged unconscious bias is part of the human condition and its impact on how we perceive, assess, and act. This would suggest we're doomed, right? We can't do anything about it? Well, the good news is that cognitive science also suggests that the unconscious mind can be reshaped, and we have the ability to rewire our thinking and enhance our approach to becoming more inclusive. There are 2 steps to consider as you assess your own thinking: perspectives and behaviors, with the goal of elevating your self-awareness, leading to more informed truths. First, we need to transcend binary thinking. Binary thinking occurs when we believe there are only 2, often opposite ways to look at a situation: right-wrong, good-bad, or love-hate. AT&T, a leading company in the diversity and inclusion space, declares that binary thinking prevents a person from considering other alternatives to address an issue. While our brains often default to taking the simplest approach to a problem, in reality, our world and our mission is too complex for this line of thinking. It takes a conscious effort to recognize when we're defaulting to binary thinking. We need to take a strategic pause, take account of our emotions and thoughts in the moment, and then open the aperture to new ideas, options, and possibilities. Breaking beyond binary thinking puts us on a path where we can become more inclusive. Next, we need to explore with empathy. In order to calibrate our thinking and perceptions, it's important to engage across the spectrum of diversity that exists in our personal and professional lives. Each engagement should begin with an open mind and an intent to learn. One can incorporate different sources of information, like reading material or news channels. This action also calls for opportunities to form new relationships across difference and seek out different perspectives to gain a deeper understanding. And don't be surprised to discover how much more you have in common with others. Exploring with the intent to understand can create discomfort, yet that is not the time to pull back. And in working through these moments with empathy and authenticity, one can gain tremendous breakthroughs. It is through these explorations that we can begin to rewire the unconscious mind. The challenge to lead by example starts here in the transform phase of the model. Through application, you can shape your mindset, influence behaviors, and drive culture change. The term inclusion nudges was coined by authors Tina Nielsen and Lisa Kopinski and is based on the theory of helping people improve their thinking and decisions. The following actions are examples of how individuals can transform their approach to make the unconscious conscious. Being an ally for all involves putting the learning into practice. Consider how you might encourage and support the religious practices of a coworker. You can also join a special observance committee or barrier analysis working group to promote the awareness and issues of an identity different than your own. Working on self is the journey toward learning about self and others through the continuous pursuit of human relations education and training opportunities. Cultivating space and grace is about creating psychological safety through the actions you take to establish safe and trusting relationships. These acts of inclusion are the basis for candid conversations and open feedback, and also allow for authentic missteps to occur so learning can take place. Owning your impact is directly related to understanding intent versus impact. The verbal and nonverbal messages that we communicate have an intended impact. Let's face it, we may miss the mark and will offend others, although there was no malicious intent. The goal here is to immediately own and sincerely address the impact of your message and not focus on what you intended. Good intent never erases bad impact. Asking, "Who are we missing?" is centered on ensuring we take account for the different perspectives that are necessary to inform our discussions and ultimately our decisions. For example, if decisions may impact the female members in our unit, then bring that insight into the room. Tracking for inclusion involves a skill of noticing what you notice. The goal is to simply take in data based on dimensions of diversity, not to analyze or interpret any meaning. For example, I may notice that 3 junior enlisted members in our staff meeting have been silent. The skill not only creates awareness, but also presents the opportunity to invite those perspectives into the conversation. It's not just enough to have diversity in the room. We also have to advocate to have those voices amplified. Visible products have an impact based on what they say or don't say. Do your part to audit the environment by addressing products such as unit logos, flyers, and visual aids to ensure they add value to an inclusive culture. Finally, it's important to practice constructive uncertainty at every opportunity. Diversity and inclusion expert Howard Ross recommends increasing self-awareness by questioning assumptions in situations where we're certainly certain we're certain. For example, ask yourself, would my comment or rating on this evaluation be the same if the ratee was another gender, or if they possess different career experiences than my own? One final note is that the ACT model is a continuous loop. As we catch ourselves being biased in a new area, we can restart the work by acknowledging the bias, calibrating our thinking, and putting mitigation action, like inclusion nudges, into practice. I also want to draw your attention to a variety of resources to assist you on this journey. These tools will not only help to build up your learning in this area, but can be shared with others in your personal and professional circles. Let's be clear, awareness and learning are just the beginning. You're now presented with an opportunity for personal contemplation, reflection, and most important, a choice to act. In closing, the Department of the Air Force is committed to a culture where all professionals have the opportunity to thrive while being valued and included. Through unconscious bias awareness, you now have the opportunity to make a tremendous impact by choosing to commit to work on self and to each other. Your service and your team are relying on it.